Good morning, everybody. Nice to see all the faces. We're going to switch over to our presentation mode in a second, but good to see everybody on here. I'm here this morning with Mike Nelson. I'm Ken Phelan, Gotham Technology Group, CTO. I'm here with Mike Nelson from CyberCX. Mike has one of the auspicious things, amongst the many other things you're going to tell us about Mike. I always think of Mike when I think of people that I've been introduced to more than 4 times. Like Mike and I just keep swinging in the same circles. He'll go, "Have you met Mike?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And Mike said the same thing with me. I was like, "Yeah, yes. In fact, we have met a few times." So, but I guess that's not a bad thing. I don't see it as a bad thing. I must be seeing the right people, Mike. If I'm seeing you all the time. Mike with CyberCX and big partner of Gotham's. We're doing a lot of work with you guys, kind of helping us out with customers for a number of different reasons that you guys are particularly good at. But I'm going to let you just take a second, introduce yourself, and kind of give some of your background.
Appreciate it, Ken, and thanks for the opportunity. So again, like Ken mentioned, Mike Nelson, Director of Strategy and Risk at CyberCX. My background is pure cybersecurity consulting. So started right out of university with PwC, loved it, did about 9 years at PwC, and actually made a kind of topical shift, moved with PwC over to Australia and spent some time over in that region. That's where I sort of locked in on and got a bunch more exposure to OT, IoT, sort of the topic of the meeting here today. Brought some of that experience back with me, have continued to build and expand on that here in the US with a bunch of clients and customers. So yeah, my background, like I said, just cybersecurity consulting, started out technical, pen testing, security architecture reviews, AppSec, and have moved a little bit more towards the cybersecurity program design and development end of the spectrum these days. But again, Ken, appreciate the opportunity to join you and the team here and talk a little IoT and OT and dive into that topic.
Cool. All right, so let's start with a little vocabulary lesson here. So we were talking a little before you even started about, I think, these things sort of get intermeshed. It's certainly a lot of market lingo. So from your perspective, I mean, how would you sort of break out the nomenclature of OT, IoT, these different sorts of areas we're talking about? What do these phrases mean to you? Like, what's the spectrum of this problem for you?
So easiest way I explain this to people is exclude traditional IT, exclude laptops, mobile phones, workstations, servers. If you exclude that, everything else is IoT or OT. Between the two of them, OT probably a little bit more traditionally focused on things like SCADA systems come to mind, process control systems, industrial control, things like, again, belts, sensors, things that make things move, make products happen, make processes sort of take place. That's OT. IoT is a much bigger sort of subset of devices and connected things where we're talking about really anything smart. If you hear the word smart describing a device today, it's IoT. If it's not traditional IT, like laptops, servers, desktops, it's IoT. And as a subset, there of IoT, you've got the OT process control systems and stuff that we talked about just a minute or so ago. So, yep, I like to kind of segment them in that way in my mind.
I mean, this has been an area of interest, at least from a market motion standpoint, just because people doing the math about the number of devices realize that this IoT world is just tremendous, right? That there's just so many everything's so smart. My refrigerator's smart, everything's smart. I just built it, did some housework and did a bunch of smart lighting. So everything's smart now. I think, so we look at that sort of explosion of smart devices. But at the same time, that hasn't traditionally been an IT problem, but it is a cyber problem. We don't do very well in some of that governance stuff. I mean, is that you see this as a governance maturity issue? Like what? Because I think the problem is big on paper, but not necessarily getting the attention it wants. Is it what is it lacking to kind of get the right? What I'm guessing you're going to consider is the right attention.
You can. So billions and billions of smart devices, like you said, just absolute explosion. The risk there, I think some of the challenges that traditional IT organizations have faced is this is a whole new frontier. do we want the responsibility? Do we want, if you have cyber security aligned as a traditional IT function, you sort of think of governance, IT, and cybersecurity under that. That's going to be really challenging structure to work through, to sort of get your hands around and mind around what is our OT, what is our IoT in our environment, how do we secure those devices. If you think of, like you said, cybersecurity as more of a business level function, more of it works alongside IT rather than as a part of IT. Organizations that are structured in that way, I think, have been able to attack this problem and figure out their OT IoT strategy a little bit more effectively. Where you're limited with cybersecurity as a subset of IT, you run into some challenges of, it's not IT. This is an engineering problem. It's an operations problem. It's separate from the IT organization. We've absolutely run into that at a bunch of customers and clients in terms of how do we figure out who's responsible for this problem set and who's responsible for addressing it.
Yeah, I'm sure you see this more than me, but the times I try to have these conversations with clients, it kind of turns into a, whatever. It's like a Forrest Gump box of chocolates. Like when you say, like, let's talk about this problem, you're not sure what you're going to get, because they might say anything from, if you're talking to a utility, they're going to be like, oh, SCADA is super important. We understand that, we're regulated, but there's a SCADA group. Like, again, they almost live in their own private Idaho, right? That's what they do. If you talk about this in a bank, they might just yawn at you and say they don't really care about smart lights. I mean, so everybody sort of has a different perception on this, up to and including, like, we don't really, like, scarily, a lot of hospitals almost like, well, medical devices just come and go because the doctors buy them and we barely are aware of them. So, I mean, I think when you bring this up, I mean, what kind of reactions have you gotten, and what kind of reaction are you hoping for in terms of, like, this is how we think about this problem?
Your medical device anecdote is a good one. It's a huge subset of IoT, right? And while there is some regulation compliance requirements for those devices, it's nowhere near comprehensive in this space. So you've got your traditional mindset, which you rightly articulated there: critical infrastructure, SCADA systems, power, water. This is a known problem set. There's teams dedicated to it. There is critical infrastructure regulation. There are requirements, laws, things like that passed for how you manage this in critical infrastructure. But if we go away from that traditional OT side of the house, a little bit more to the IoT type stuff, that's where I'd say there's a lot more opportunity for understanding, where does this apply? How does it need to be controlled? How does it need to be addressed, as a risk? And most importantly, which I think we're going to get into in the conversation here in a minute or so, who owns it and how do you start addressing it? How do you start looking at the set and understanding what type of IoT devices do we have? Who manages them? Who's responsible for them? Who patches them? If you want to think about OT as traditional process, critical infrastructure, manufacturing, that's fine. That's okay. But there are absolutely IoT security considerations that apply in financial services, healthcare, industries like that maybe don't fall into that traditional mold of critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I guess, there's lots of ways this can annoy me. I don't have to bring it up to the customer, but I'll do two. One is that, like I said, in that sort of traditional, like, utility type world or manufacturing world, a lot of what you'll see is it's a separate group. That separate group has been doing it for decades, and a lot of their defenses are really just segmentation. Like, we just separate it; it's its own thing. A lot of it's just security through obscurity. No one knows how these devices work. They're all outdated. They're all old. They're all, whatever, NT4 machines that run CDC cams or whatever. Like, it's all kind of craziness going on, but it's all, like, segmented. So you're kind of bumping your head against that group. I guess I'll tell you the other one too. You deal with both. The other one is the other side of the spectrum is when you go into a financial institution that's a large institution, and they just don't see, again, smart lighting, smart environment, like all these things are just like, again, we separate them and we kind of don't care. So, I mean, I guess, how do you approach those two clients and sort of kind of get them to look at this as a different problem, a new problem, or an important problem?
Segmentation, one of a few different strategies that you can apply to sort of better secure, better protect these types of devices. So segmentation is good. There's no doubt about it. The ability to effectively put these devices on their own network segment, again, whether that's in critical infrastructure, in FS, it's one step in the right direction. But OT has to have internet connectivity, has to talk to IT. IoT has to talk to your IT systems in order for these business processes to be able to function in many cases. So rather than saying, we're going to segment off this stuff, we're going to put it all, on its own network segment, let it run that way. The way to think about it is by business process. What do these devices have to interact with, have to be able to talk to, have to be able to connect with in order to do the thing that we've brought them on board to do? So what I mean by that is it's not really been an approach, or it was an early days approach of saying we're going to have an OT network segment, right? We're going to put all of this stuff out there on an OT network segment, and it's not going to be able to cross over. It's not going to be able to touch our IT. What today has gone a little bit more of a shift in the way that you think about architecting these types of environments is I'm going to allow this stuff to talk to what it needs to, and that's going to be this business process network segment, right? And so if that particular business process gets compromised, gets an availability impact, it's not affecting other things that it doesn't need to work with and doesn't need to talk to. Problem was, like you said, Ken, in early days, all OT, IoT, most of it, super old, super outdated, unpatched, vulnerable, easy to compromise, running on Windows 7, that type of stuff. When you could see it from the outside, you compromise one OT device or IoT device. Then, if it's segmented in a way in which we've got all our OT or IoT on that same segment, that's a jumping off point. Instead, the business process segmentation strategy has been a little bit more effectively adopted, a little bit more effectively used in organizations that are doing this, in kind of the buzzwordy, zero trust, like more common model, or more, I should say, more leading model of the day to address this.
Yeah, I think look, and I think part of a lot of customers, I think, also see this on some level as a legal problem, right? It's a third-party risk problem because these are all SaaS providers. To your point, like the world of this is just an on-site device that has software on it, doesn't exist anymore. Everything's getting auto-patched, everything's being managed by the cloud, everything talks out to the cloud, everything's a SaaS. And so they're trying to, even understand these things, but again, a lot of organizations will buy these types of services and not really even vet the vendor, never mind do like a full third-party risk analysis. And then to your point, not even put controls around it. I mean, do you think is that one of the things you're talking about is just the legal frame or the software bill of materials frame on this, or?
It is. So legal and risk management aspects of managing OT and IoT, again, I kind of look at that as, yes, there are legal and risk management responsibilities to managing these devices. Has your organization effectively quantified and managed that risk? What we struggle with is organizations that kind of take that approach and say, if we get popped via an OT device, IoT device, that's the vendor's responsibility. That should have been something that they're taking care of. Okay, well, from a legal and risk management perspective, have you done the due diligence to ensure that they are insured to the level of availability, impact that could cause if that breaks a big business process or a key critical business process for you? There's also the factor there that your insurance provider is unlikely to follow that story of, hey, we were, breached via a vendor. It was an issue with the vendor device. okay, show us what you were doing to have a reasonable standard of management of those vendor devices. Again, understanding, having visibility of them. You can't totally transfer the risk to a vendor or to, sort of the manufacturer of the device or the implementer of the device. And what's even more concerning is you got to back up a half step and figure out who has the responsibility if something were to go wrong with this type of device. Again, I'll use the FS example. Ken, I know Gotham has a bunch of financial services clients, and again, this sort of comes up as hey, do we really have to care about these things? What happens with an connected ATM outage, an issue at branches sort of across the country for a financial services client when, hey, the vendor or the manufacturer has had an issue and it's causing us not to be able to operate ATMs, something like that. That's not something that can easily be risk transferred. You got to understand what is the quantification of that risk, what's the exposure here, what's the potential impact to us should an event like that happen.
Yeah, I think part of it too, like just to get people aware of it. I watched a Black Hat last year. I watched somebody break an electronic door system. Hack an electronic door system so they could open the doors in a building. And watching it, it was like, I don't know what I thought was supposed to be an electronic door system, but it just occurred to me all these smart devices are just little Linux machines. Like they're just little Linux machines that may or may not be patched. If you told someone that you're gonna drop random Linux machines from all these vendors all over and think of them as just like these little Linux machines, of course you have all the risk of that, and everyone would be worried about it. But instead, there's this sort of perception, like, well, if I'm buying a door system, it's some sort of hardwired silicon, it's proprietary. I'm like, no, there's nothing proprietary about the nature of these devices in this economy. These are all Linux systems that are software on them. That's what they are.
And even more to that point, most of them aren't even full operating systems anymore, right? They're just
Right.
sort of infrastructure as code or cloud-based things. And so, as such, what do? You no longer have the traditional paradigm of, we're going to deploy, an endpoint monitoring solution on it and monitor it that way to make sure it's not compromised or nothing
Right.
sort of happens to it. Same thing with, again, how do you do vulnerability scanning of some of these devices if they're not full-fledged operating systems? Again, they're containerized. They're just, like I said, infrastructure as code in some cases, like super small is not necessarily, we can't take these super traditional approaches of just monitor the endpoint, do vulnerability scanning on it, because it's a little bit of a different problem set. It's a little bit of a different, like you said, mini scaled down devices that aren't as full-fledged. How can you ensure or try to ensure that those devices are protected as best as possible? Not an easy thing to do when they don't have the traditional approach to having sort of the infrastructure behind it as those traditional approaches would allow.
Yeah, and I think there's just a sense of urgency problem, because I think when you talk about this to a customer, and one of the first things that happens, my experience, like you're doing a scan, what you're really doing is showing how big the problem is, right? When you do this, you're going to find out. And so I don't want to say ignorance is bliss, but sometimes ignorance does get to keep its job. So that conversation about, listen, it's worth finding out what this problem looks like because of the risk. I mean, how do you kind of create the urgency to get past this? Like, well, right now I don't know, and maybe I'm too busy doing other things, and maybe I don't want to know.
Ties into the single biggest both problem and opportunity with OT and IoT security. The single biggest problem is, like we said a few minutes ago on this call, we know that once stones start being overturned, you're going to find things. You're going to find vulnerable systems. You're going to find issues. But that also represents a huge opportunity for a win for whatever part of the organization is sort of saying, we're going to own this. We're going to make this our problem. And we are going to demonstrate impact here. OT and IoT security is still, and especially on the IoT side, OT has done this a little bit more effectively. It's still, people are hesitant to dive in because they know what they're going to find. But I look at that, I sort of shift it and look at that as an opportunity that you are going to be able to demonstrate by diving into this problem set. You're going to be able to demonstrate huge impact by taking this thing on and saying, okay, we need to figure out what's the risk here? What can we do about it? As soon as you start looking, you're immediately going to be presented with, I can do something about that. I can do something about that. I can do something about that, whether it's segmentation, whether it's more effective patching, whether it's more effective, just sort of management of this environment. You will quickly uncover, you're going to have a chance to make an impact and like demonstrably add security to the posture of the organization.
Yeah, and again, I totally agree that these are problems that have to be brought up, but that doesn't mean they're not without pain. Like, I mean, one of the things you're going to bump into right away is that nobody knows how to do software lifecycle management, right? So joking about that Windows 7 machine that you blow the dust off of that no one's touched, and the reason why it's still Windows 7 machine is because the software that you must use to run this machine you run, that company went out of business 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever, and so like you're obviously not getting that patch. So like you're going to run into these situations where like this is foundationally flawed, and somebody needs to fix this on a foundational level, and that's always a difficult conversation with a customer to kind of expose that stuff. But I mean, I guess it's just the answer, like take your medicine, or what is your answer to that question about that Windows 7 machine?
Well, think about what you're trying to do from a business perspective of digging into this problem, right? So you rightly mentioned a little bit earlier, Ken, it's a risk reduction type of thing, or it may be in some industries a compliance driven thing if you're a little bit more on the OT side of the house. So fundamentally, what you are trying to do is reduce risk to the organization, either because you're compelled to do so or because it's the right thing to do so to not have security, availability, integrity impacting events and incidents. So when I say that, what I mean by that is there's kind of a challenge. It's a question here that you and I prepared with, Ken. Like, what is the right way to start biting this off and start attacking this? Like why do you have to do it, and how do you go about doing it? It's not necessarily by going and procuring a tool and having it light up with the thousands of vulnerabilities or issues or things that you're going to see in the OT environment, when you start running it and when you start scanning and when you start digging deeper. The first part of effectively addressing the problem is business communications at the level of, we know we're going to find things here. We know that this is going to be something that we have to work through. We know that this is going to be a partnership between security, engineering, operations. You need that business level buy-in to sort of attack this and have an understanding that, look, when we do this, when we dig in a little bit deeper here, we're going to be uncovering things. We're going to bite off what we can at a pace that we can. It's why I always say, for organizations going to address IoT security or OT security for the first time, hopefully there's not many addressing OT security for the first time, you have to approach it with a plan, a roadmap, a strategy to doing it. It is not, let's go procure something, turn it on, and immediately be overwhelmed by the number of findings and issues and vulnerabilities that we're going to discover.
Yeah, I'm really to dig in on that, because that unfortunately the whole industry is just pushing people to like buy a product, which is the product, do the scan,
Absolutely.
and whatever. Even with some fanciful, in some cases, concepts that some of these products help remediate, which in my experience they don't. But in any case, they that so if I'm sitting here worried about this problem, like how do I? Because the business people that you want this alliance with, again, like they're even more incented than you might be to basically ostrich on this and not look at it. So let's talk about that conversation. Like, do you start with the risk? Would I go up to the head of risk and say, look, here's the risk and here's the plan, but here's the exception handlers. Like how do I do this in a rational way that doesn't make me just look like I'm trying to get attention?
You started as risk, right? You started with risk. So security professionals in a security organization are tasked with identifying, remediating, or in some ways addressing, let's say addressing, are tasked with identifying and addressing risk. If you're ostriching, and if you're saying, hey, we know that there's problems over here, we just don't have the time, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the expertise, you put yourself in a pretty precarious position, right? So we've heard news stories and in court cases, like some of the most recent things with Uber and other CISOs. What's kind of hot in the industry right now is, did you do what was reasonable? Did you do what was reasonably expected? You're going to have a real hard time defending a position of, we know we had IoT stuff, we didn't do anything about it. Even if that first step is just achieving and establishing a position of, we're going to quantify the risk, that's what gets you going. From there, this is also key, nobody is planning and implementing an IoT security program by saying, in 3 months, we're going to be doing this, in 6 months, we're going to be doing this, in 12 months, we're going to be doing this. You're planning for month 0 to 6, which is, here's how we're going to identify it. Here's how we're going to assign responsibility for it or understand responsibility for it. And at that time, after this initial dive into the problem, now is when you can get tactical on road mapping, understanding who's going to be doing what, what's going to be remediated when, what's our plan for sunsetting systems, replacing systems, patching systems, going out to vendors, updating contracts, updating responsibilities. It is both a big problem, but also you break it down to start into a small problem, which is, what I'm going to do first, or what the organization is going to do first, is quantify this risk. And that's where you get the business backing. Nobody should be saying, we're not comfortable with quantifying a risk, or we're not comfortable with identifying a risk, because that is the job, that is the actual role, that is the role, specifically of risk management professionals, of which cybersecurity can be part of them.
Yeah, I think it helps. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this. I mean, I think it helps if you've got some concept of, like, what are your exception handlers, right? What are your compensating controls going to be like? I think if you can kind of paint some pictures of, like, I'm not going to come to you and tell you that Windows 7 machine has to be fixed tomorrow or you're fired. Here are some different ways in which we'll manage systems while they're in flight, while they're in process, while we worry about this. Like, I mean, does NDR have a role here? Like it's such a segmentation, as you were saying, because segmentation. But what can we do that's intelligent to sort of handle the difficult exceptions that aren't easily fixed as they're discovered, and not just be sort of scofflaws about it?
So it's conversation on, where do you start once you've identified some of the risk, once you've quantified some of the risk. Or if you're not ready to go across the board and do a big wide-ranging program or wide-ranging sort of discovery effort, what can you do to demonstrably reduce risk in this space? One, remote access. The number of vendors that have remote access to IoT and OT systems is astonishingly high and worryingly high. Do you know what systems in your environment your vendors have access to? Each of those are potential access vectors to other internal systems, pivoting from there, going further. So first of all, remote access is a huge one. Second one is, what has internet connectivity? Basically, if you kind of follow the train of thought, like, what can become a vector for remote access? Even if in that first category, I was more talking about, what has TeamViewer on it? What has remote desktop open? This second category is, what IoT systems or OT systems have channels open and connectivity open to the internet, even if they don't have that software on it, even if they don't have specific, remote access mechanisms. What ports are open? Now we're back to sort of the traditional approach to, hey, understanding what your perimeter is. That concept, that really traditional IT concept of sort of a security perimeter and what faces the internet, also applies for OT and for IoT. What is your IoT OT perimeter, and what's segmented off, like you said a little bit earlier, Ken, and running a process in a factory or in a facility somewhere, or even like I said, in a bank, like making sure something is sent from the teller location out to the drive-through window. Like, all of those systems should be understood from the perspective of, are they internet exposed or not internet exposed? And you could do that without deeply diving into the problem. So remote access and what's internet exposed is kind of the place to start, and to be able to start making some impact with that earlier strategy that you mentioned of segmentation.
It's hard without the data, because you end up sort of like doing just like sort of FUD conversations about, and these are true conversations, like, and again, they're not all public, but like, forget the Colonial Gas and Merck and that stuff, but like even down to like I know a bank that had a gym system, a gym management system in one of their gyms, in one of their locations, and the gym management system got turned over, right? It's still a computer on site, right? So, in the workout room. And so again, you don't know what you don't know, but at the same time, you don't want to keep pointing to all these anecdotes. I'd rather give somebody real risk analysis.
And for banks specifically, I love this part here. There's a really relevant comment around, to make IoT and OT security work, you have to tie it to a business imperative, or tie it to, a business objective or a business outcome. So for manufacturing and traditional OT type stuff, that's health and safety. You could say, we're tying the security of these devices because, look, if this belt or scanner or something gets impacted, we could have incorrect weights, incorrect operation of machines, devices. That's a huge problem. That's a huge health and safety risk. And so when you put it in that perspective, people that work around OT get it. For banks, financial services industry, fraud. What if you don't have the ability to identify who was in your bank at what time, via your camera systems? What if you don't have the ability to identify who was using what system at what time, who was physically present? Like, all of these IoT systems that we're talking about here, how many regulations and responsibilities are there around fraud and, knowing your customer, that type of stuff in the banking and FS industry? This supports that. You have to tie it to a business responsibility, like a business sort of goal, business outcome of fraud management. Everybody in banking knows that that's a huge imperative. Well, this actually helps enable that. IoT in banking ties to that really critical aspect.
Yeah. I mean, on the solution side of this, I mean, when you're doing this discovery and doing everything else, I mean, I'd be kind of tempted, but obviously there's pitfalls to kind of start having a conversation about, software supply chain, like getting the stuff as it comes through the door and doing some initial analysis, so that people aren't just buying, IoT stuff and throwing it in the organization all the time that I have to discover. I mean, do you see organizations with good practices in that space of just sort of putting this into the onboarding procurement process, or?
And this is where it's a partnership between engineering and operations and, like a security function. So going to segment again off to, the traditional OT side of the house. Yes, absolutely. When new systems, when new things are being procured, you expect security involvement from how is this going to be architected? How's this going to be deployed? What's going to be opened up? You see things like security checklists, security, design reviews, security deployment reviews, pen testing after the fact. That's in place. For IoT, it's a little bit more of a business wants something, business is going to go get something. Is security effectively embedded into the SDLC to be able to say, okay, what does that mean for us, either from an exposure perspective or from a protection perspective, like what we need to do with those devices. I do see on the IoT side of the house things like SOC 2 reviews, who are we getting it from? Let's review their documentation. What we'd also like to see, what doesn't happen enough yet, is okay, during the proof of concept stage, or during, hey, we're thinking about getting this thing, actually poking and prodding on it, right? And working with a third party, working with somebody who sort of has expertise in this space to understand the security implications of getting a set of IoT devices or introduce a process that uses heavily, IoT devices. There's a lot more to do than just saying, okay, I read the vendor or manufacturer's, SOC 2 report, their spec, what they gave us that says what they do about security. You actually have to go to the next level of design review, implementation review, testing after the fact. That's where there's more to be done.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just break this down, because I think we're talking about, we walked through the process, but let's just be super prescriptive here. So you talked about like a first step. Like, what is the first step to call in a consulting company? Is your first step to look at it yourself? Like, the people who are watching this thinking about this problem, what initial analysis should they do? What is the very first, after this call? Let's just say I'm going to do something. What should I do?
Start by cataloging, and I don't mean spreadsheet, I mean bulleted list. Start by cataloging your most critical IoT or OT devices. Just think about it from a business process perspective. So, hey, we have this really big critical business process. We produce widgets, or we operate banking branches, or we provide healthcare, or we, like I said, manufacture X. Think about your most critical business processes. Try to get to 5, maybe 10, 5 or 10. What are the potential IoT devices that enable those processes? When you think through from start to finish, this is how we start producing a widget. This is how we end up with the produced widget. What's involved there? Just bulleted list of systems. Then you're on the right path. Then, once you have that list of thinking, okay, these might be some of our most critical IoT devices, supporting some of our most critical processes, then you start to dive into the next level of patches these things, who maintains these things, who owns these things, are they ours or are they vendors? Are they, something that is, like we talked about earlier, vulnerability scanned? Are they something that we have visibility of? Start by identifying those critical devices, super simple, bulleted list format, then noodle a little bit on, okay, and now having this list, how comfortable do I feel about these devices are being, the different practices that we talked about here, scanned, identified, ownership, I understand who owns the rest, patched. That's where you go next. Then is when you can start talking about, hey, I really have, a problem identifying OT or IoT devices and understanding what our most critical ones are. That's where a tool like the tooling that we talked about a little bit earlier can be helpful in identifying those types of things. If it's not well understood, that tool can be helpful sort of quantifying the problem set.
Yeah, I think the tools have different strengths and weaknesses too, in terms of some of them, some are just purely SCADA. Like that, again, there are tool sets more tied to specific sort of problem areas once you kind of understand what those problem areas are. But at least there are a lot of new tools. I mean, do you feel like the new tools are getting better? I mean, there's lots of people releasing in this space. I mean, is the industry making progress in this coverage?
No magic bullet, but tools for OT security or IoT security do several things very well. One, they'll tell you what you have. They'll tell you, I can see traffic from X, Y, Z. So they help with that first problem of IoT, OT asset identification. Killer. That's kind of a capability of tools across the board. That's great. Then they can help, some of the tools can help tell you are those devices or systems vulnerable? And they do that in a variety of different ways. They do that sometimes via passive listening and understanding, the traffic and just seeing, again, like what ports are open. That's one way. There's also active scanning and active, hey, I'm going to go see if this thing has vulnerabilities by sending some code or, sending some commands to it to see how it responds. Have to be careful with that. Always, 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 you're going to have a period of passive listening and understanding and cataloging before you do any type of active, and hey, now that I know about this, is it vulnerable? Is it a problem? Is there risk associated with this device? How is it going to respond to being queried or scanned? Got to do the passive stuff first, and that's got to go for a period of time that allows you to collect and infer what those devices are doing, what their purposes are. Are they potentially exposed, to the internet? Who's using them? Who's managing them? What are they talking to? That passive period is super, super, super key before you get into actively using some of these tools to, this is kind of the new feature set of these tools, is we can also tell you what's vulnerable. Really, really careful with that. You have to be really, really careful with that until you have kind of the background data that would make you comfortable with actively querying.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a couple of things. It's signal to noise ratio, like I look for, and more specifically, what's in actual things. I think the better products do a much better job of really identifying exactly what this device is, not just, oh, there's a device. Exactly what is this device, exactly what the versions are, exactly vulnerabilities. Like the more data it's giving you is going to help you prioritize, because if all you're getting is a laundry list of like, I've identified a bunch of things and you don't know what they are, and I kind of don't know either. I just know that they live over here in the network. It's not really that useful. All that is a bunch of homework to go do now.
Exactly. So now you get into the expanding capabilities of these products, which are, hey, and after we tell you what you have, and after we tell you whether it's vulnerable, we can help you, segment things, which is a feature, of some of these possibilities. We can help you again understand, like you said, Ken, when this thing was last patched, how often is it being patched? This kind of next level feature set of some of these IoT OT product capabilities, they all do the traditional things well of asset identification, but each of them have a little bit different, and we do this next step, and we can help you with this next step. Like I said, there are ones geared towards segmentation, there are ones geared towards vulnerability management, there are ones geared towards a couple of different capabilities there.
Yeah, I think that's important, just because I don't want to, I'd like you to think a little bit about describing, like, we talked about a lot of different elements here that would be in a sophisticated, mature program, right? Everything from third-party risk to CLC, all these other things that would be in there. But like this ability for these tools to have tool sets to kind of help automate, manage it, because you can't, again, uncover a problem that turns into, another 10,000 man years of labor. You can't discover that we must build the pyramids tomorrow. So, starting off from a process of, let's think about an end state that's manageable, that works in our budgets, etc. So, like, if you were describing like what this looks like when it's right, what does it look like when it looks right? Like, how does it operate?
Looks like risk quantified. So an understanding of, where do we have systems, where do we feel good about those systems versus where do we feel iffy about those systems. So it starts with knowing what the problem is, not necessarily yet addressing it, not necessarily, cleaning everything up all at once. Like you said, it's got to bite this off in chunks. When it's running effectively, when a program like this is running effectively, it's able to identify and quantify risk in the IoT and OT space. It's also able to remediate or address that risk. And that's where we get into the business partnership that has to be there to understand, okay, we have a risk. What do we do about it? Is that a security responsibility to remediate it? Is it an engineering responsibility to remediate it? An operations responsibility to remediate it? Nobody should be granting, exceptions or exemptions without having all of those parties in the room able to discuss how critical is this? What compensating controls do we have in place? That's where you have to have the conversation in an effectively operating program of what is the risk? What are we doing about this risk? What are our possible paths forward for this risk? How do we get this reduced or taken care of?
Awesome. All right, so we're coming kind of up on my target of 45 minutes, but is there anything we didn't talk about? Stuff you want to say? Is there any way you want to like wrap up on this? But what do we forget to talk about?
Just a small anecdote. I said I come up against that mindset pretty often of I don't have a compliance requirement here, and I don't have to, why do I have to work on this? Why do I start uncovering problems when I don't need to be uncovering problems?
Yeah.
Besides compliance, there's another big party in the room. I think we briefly mentioned it, that is doing more here besides regulators. Insurers. Insurers are asking you, do you have OT? What type of OT? How is this OT managed? Who is responsible for this type of stuff? It's kind of the classic American, before we put in regulation where there is a financial implication, there will be focus, right? The insurers are jumping on this and saying, okay, OT and IoT security, expect more and more questions along those lines from insurers, as insurers are doing everything that they can to get better at setting pricing for premiums, to set an understanding of your organization and how much risk you present to them. You'll see more coming on this from insurers, and probably already have started to.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, a good reason to get started in my mind is if we talk about, as we're talking about this sort of rational program of looking, thinking, bullet points, talking partnerships, whatever. This is going to take months and probably years, not weeks. And so you can't wait until your insurance company is yelling at you to get this horse back in the barn. It is going to take a little bit of time. Obviously, different size organizations are going to matter, but do you think it's months? I mean, just even the initial part, just initial risk assessment has to be a few months, right?
I agree with that. Yeah, 8-10 weeks, maybe up to 12 weeks, large size organization, like you said, a couple of months for quantifying the problem set. Right. Then from there is when you build that longer term program. But even achieving that first, couple of weeks, 2 months, 3 months of effort in saying, we understand what we have to do here, we understand how much we have to do here, that's what gets you going down the right path. So I fully agree with you that it's a longer term program, but it's a program that you could chunk into logical segments, which basically says, first, we're going to spend 3 months doing this, identifying the problem set. Then we're going to spend 3 months, developing our roadmap, responsibilities, getting everybody on board. Then we're going to go execute a year-long program, or and it'll become an ongoing program, because that's probably a last piece to mention here, Ken, is you said, what does this look like when it's effectively operating, like mature companies that have gone and gotten down to this stage? Think of traditional IT SOCs. OT SOCs or IoT SOCs is the end stage, the end, hey, and we have this stuff effectively managed and monitored.
Well, I know there are a couple people live. I don't know if we got any questions during the group. If Kelly or Ali, if they could just, do we have any questions? No? I just want to give the live people who actually log in a chance to ask and say the live time. All right, but this is really great, Mike. Thanks so much for doing this. Do you have any questions? Oh, any other last comments? I can't wait to meet you again, since I meet you all the time. I must ask a lot of questions, and they're like, sooner or later, they're like, Mike knows the answer. We'll get Mike. So apparently, you know the answers to a lot of questions, because I get introduced to you a lot. Good. Anything else today, Mike? Good.
Take it. It's maybe that's a good rep to have. Is like,
this
person. Yeah, it's a good rep to have.
Yeah.
This person.
Have you met Mike? That's going to be your new tagline.
This person understands this, and this person, can help me see sort of the responsibility here or, you know, the risk here. So that's great, Ken. No, like I said, I really appreciate the opportunity. I know that we have partnered on some of this work. Like you said earlier, we're partnering on more of it to come. This is a growing and evolving area of cyber, of security overall. You'll see more from insurers, you'll see more from regulators, you'll see more from product companies, you'll see more from consulting firms like mine saying, hey, you need to do something about this. It's working with a partner that has the understanding and that has gone and, you know, done this at organizations before and can say, we know it's a huge problem set. Let us help you break it down into chunks and, you know, get something going in the right direction.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Mike. It's good seeing you as always. And I think this is a very important thing to kind of get out in front of. So I'm glad we put this together for Gotham's customers. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great day, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. Call if you need anything else. Bye.